I just find it difficult for me to put myself in those people's bodies and actually know whether, like, they can even, like, see them from an objective point of view and see what they're missing out on. If someone was to just present them like, look, this is the evidence, look at the evidence, and then they'll always find like some sort of like reasons to, like, granted it could be legit reasons, but it's almost like a no, I don't. It's from what I see, it's like they just want to turn the face around because some evidence is just irrefutable. It gets to a point where you're just like, all right now, and so um, it's
It,
almost like they just want to close the eyes and like block their ears and then go to the other side and then be like, hey, we're fighting against the very evil,
yeah, I
but
mean,
in fact they're actually the evil people.
it, it is very problematic because you have to make somewhat of a factual basis of that. You have to give them just the idea that there is an alternative. I mean, imagine if they already took over society, or imagine if they already had the Gestapo thought police, ideological police, controlling society. It would be completely lost. So just the idea that there is an opposing sort of viewpoint that is, not obviously they believe it's invalid, but just the idea that there are people that are opposed to them, that is needed as a somewhat as a precondition. But you can't actually push. You can't use that against them. It's completely irrelevant because, as I've already sort of tried to say, is that they don't care about reality. They really are filtering reality at an incredibly, sort of invidious and biased deconstruction just to preserve their very fragile emotional arguments. But the point that I want to make here is that you need to actually talk about the ideological facts, as it were, in terms of their own methodology, in terms of how they cover their own system in some sense. So you can use like one fact as an example, but you should always abstract it. So not even if the fact is right or wrong or who's right or wrong about the fact, but how they deal with the fact, how they incorporate it into their worldview, how they digest it, how they sort of process it. This is also slightly problematic because according to their ideology, they don't have to know, they don't have to realize anything, they don't have to know anything. They can just hypothetically believe that somebody else in their collective knows it for them in some sense. So that there's this kind of collective recipe that they just have to be a part of. And so they don't have a working understanding of what it is that they are doing and what it is that they are engaged in. They just know that they are on the right side, as it were. That's the only thing that they understand, that they are on the right side. And so debunking that in some sense, is fundamentally problematic because they already believe in a blind faith, and it gives good promises. So in some sense, the whole cornerstone of their belief, essentially, I mean, this is the biggest problem with fascistic thinking, is that you cannot confront it directly because in the end they will always say, well, we're not making a moral argument, we're making a prediction, we're making a promise that if we had policy, if we controlled society, if we had our way, that we would get there in the end, that the means would justify the ends. That is their basic tenet in some sense.
Yeah.
And so you can't just, so you have to be very sophisticated in terms of debunking it, and that is very problematic because you're dealing with, individual zealots that are I wish I could have repeated some of that stuff that we spoke about earlier, just to sort of fill out this. I don't want to repeat it just for the sake of the recording, but anyway.
Well, I pretty much get you. So, at least from my subjective experience, like what you've been explaining is essentially what I've been like noticing from a distance, so to speak.
So I would like to repeat that again because that is some novel thinking. I mean, I've talked about it, but you see, my thoughts only properly coalesce when I'm talking to someone. in terms of like that guilt thing that you brought up, and so my idea is that, like, so normally people would be responsible for their own lives, not in the sense that they would be guilty for the conditions that they have inherited, for instance, but that they would have responses to those conditions that would not just be this false dichotomy of guilt or innocence, that they would perhaps be anxious, and that anxiety would give them a kind of a primer as to how to navigate their own independent existence, that they would work out how to assuage that anxiety, or sort of work out something that makes them sad and work on that, and they would have an emotional array of things to sort of make progress on whatever it was that then gets sort of, where the ideological alternative is that issue gets thrown into the sort of the identity sausage factory, or sausage maker, where you just sort of throw that issue into, well, somebody else is guilty for it, which creates this looming ideological implicit alternative that if the ideology is wrong, then you are guilty for the condition. So it's like a false binary. Either somebody else must be blamed for it and must take on the guilt, or you are somewhat, or your identity is guilty from it. And so I think the core of dismantling the ideology is really to dismantle the concept of identity and how dehumanizing it is, and the idea of the collective experience, and actually describing how close that is to the Nazi ideal, or how it is the Nazi value system.
So essentially, that's the game that it will eventually turn out to be, given enough time, if you just let it manifest.
No, well, this is the implicit ideological premise of their whole framework. And so it would be better not to talk about facts, not to talk about, oh, well, this historical thing had these effects on these people. That is playing into their hand in some sense, because you're sort of, if you take an opposing side in that factual argument, you're just sort of balkanizing on the level of identity in some sense. I mean, like, I would say, okay, well, this comes out in a lot of my other YouTube recordings, but what is the parts of reality, the most important parts of reality that become invisible to their ideology, are the most important parts, are the most humanizing parts, and the most important parts in terms of making real progress against real challenges, because their solutions don't actually fix the problem. I said this before in our conversation, that they just generate more identity consciousness instead of actually making any kind of pragmatic ground, because they have to dishonestly or inauthentically make it an identity problem instead of like a problem of people on the ground. And so because they're not people, they are identity people. They have identity problems. They don't have just like generic problems that have generic solutions, or when I say generic, I mean practical. So it no longer becomes a practical problem, it becomes an ideological problem. And so you end up creating, in solving the problem their way, you end up actually exacerbating the problem. Because almost to prove...
See, you can make a market out of that too. Because you can say, okay, well, there's so many people that has these problems, and I have this problem.
So it really is.
They're going to connect to me if I was to spin it around.
It's a self-fulfilling prophecy as well, in some sense, because they have to solve the problem as they have conceived of it, and as they have, sorry, there's a better word, as they have contrived, not just contrived, as they have condensed it, what's the word that means, as they've constructed it. And so as they tackle the problem as they have specifically constructed it, it really is tantamount to bad faith, because they, in fixing the problem as they see it, they have to prove themselves right simultaneously. And so, when you get racists in charge, essentially, of fixing a problem, because these are identity racists, like, it's just horrendous. Yeah, no, well, the biggest sort of problem is, on this level, is that, in some sense, they do make their identity look comparatively better, but it's not by increasing the well-being of their identity, it's by decreasing the well-being of other identities. So in some sense, they are making the identities more equal, but they're doing it by destroying other people, not by bringing themselves up, or bringing up their identity faction. It's quite... So ideologically, they are actually technically you can save their ideology in some technical way, but it's worthless. I mean, it's a worthless device. You know, it's a worthless mechanism to drive.
It's equality versus equity, fundamentally.
Yeah, I mean, I know Jordan Peterson has centered around, or has sort of, said that these are the buzzwords that you have to be afraid of in some sense. And I think the context of using those buzzwords was to say, look, if, like, just for parents of children that don't want their children to be infected by this identity racism, like if the class says equity on it, just stay clear of it. But I mean, I'm much more careful and precise in my use of words. So I mean, like, there is a space for equity in some judicial jurisprudence and stuff like that, but as it's been co-opted in this ideology, it has become somewhat a toxified, or it has become poisonous. But anyway, I mean, these things would have some proper place for them somewhere in a conceptual system, but okay, so that's somewhat tangential, but yeah, I would really center on their false idol, which is identity, their touchstone, which is identity, which is an oversimplified way of working out problems, and it is, hypothetically, it's very convenient. That's why they don't want to put it down as well, because if you can just, but it is somewhat, it gets into
it absolves all responsibility
Yeah.
to grow up.
It creates enough invisibility to make the issues perpetually simple and convenient for the hypothetical strongman politician that could just come in and sort of institute from the top down a perfect system. So it does have that kind of utopian top down sort of just give the political leaders more power, or not any leader, but give political leaders that represent identities more power, which is effectively the fascistic mantra, the separate but equal development, which was also a slogan in apartheid. But that is something that I've also described in a lot of my YouTube videos, the separate but equal sort of formula, because a lot of their thinking, and when I say their, I mean identity politics thinking, proponents of identity politics, it is sort of founded on this very fuzzy, fudged principle of separate but equal. And obviously it is fundamentally problematic, because it just doesn't, it might sound good to some people who don't, a clever 5-year-old could think through the bad faith and the kind of the brittle ethical positions that you could sort of crank through the separate but equal sort of sausage machine. But I mean, it is a phrase that should carry very evil charge, and I know it is basically at the core of that is what they mean when they say equality. They don't mean equality as a principle, they mean equality as an adjective, and that adjective can only be grounded in something like separate but equal, because that is like a full state preposition in some sense. So when they say equality, what they mean by that is separate but equal. In some sense, they must be separate because they have different identities, and in some sense, those identities must be regarded as equal for it to be just, or something like that. But even this gets a bit too abstract, because I mean, yeah, sorry, this is the point that I was you can also focus on the present, so it's like feminists, which they go on and on and on about equality, and it's like, well then, why don't you just, even if things aren't equal, why don't you just consider that people should be treated equally in some sense, by individuals, on an individual one-to-one basis, not as a structural guarantee, but that people should, like, you can, if you find someone who isn't treating other people equally, you can argue with them, or you can try to persuade them, but like, that is what you have to do. That's where it leads to, in some sense. Like, why don't you just start doing that instead of having this sort of structural activism? And the excuse for the structural activism, in some sense, I mean, it is an ego trip. It is a kind of autistic narcissism that I wish I had recorded. But in some sense, it's a way to insulate the self, but also to disassociate the self and disconnect the self from the present, from actually having to enter the present and actually having to have your own individual or independent responsibility. And women historically, people, never mind like the oppression that women have suffered, women themselves are an incredibly oppressive force, like, and they've not been wanting to own this power and their accountability in, how fucked up things are. Women have contributed to many, many bad things, and still we have this kind of generalization, social norms that women still mobilize essentially to protect their bad behavior as a block in some sense. Probably the biggest stumbling block in the progress of substantive equality in terms of cultural values is the privilege that females have in some sense. If they didn't have privilege, and in some sense, there perhaps are biological reasons as well. This makes it complicated to have this on the recording, I guess. But like, women are not the same as men in some sense, and they do have different. They have different immediate goals. Like, they have to, at a younger age, they have to be successful biologically and have a family and get pregnant and stuff like that, which means that they have to automatically try to target men that are more established and that will generally be older than them in some sense. They have to learn how to, because they are treated so well in general by society, because they're given so much for their biological value, they're given so much social value. They've got this extra capital which they can essentially squander, or they can use, let's say, more responsibly. But that extra power and that deficit in that power means that they're often able to avoid maturing as human beings. They just, because they're essentially treated so much better, and they get so many get out of jail free cards in some sense, and because they are jealous of guarding that cultural power in some sense, they have eventually started stepping on their own toes. A lot of the complaints of feminism are effectively the negative interference of other women, impacting badly on the interests of other women. So it's like, because essentially you can't you can't have your cake and eat it in some sense, and that is the problem, that women want to have their cake and eat it as the feminist movement. And it's just literally impossible. So the only way to sort of divert from that internal incoherence essentially is to make broad structural accusations and criticisms, and to create a kind of, and not enter the immediate vehicle of equality, which they could, as individuals, they could adopt. They could actually imbue that. They could enter into a social setting. They could go out at night and they could say, I'm not a woman in this privileged class with these different rules that other people have to play by because of my identity. They could be a non-sexualist. They could act on a one-to-one level with other human beings. They pretend to do some level of this when they're ideological, because they're like, okay, well, if other people believe in my ideology, then we share the same kind of conspiracy theory, and because we believe in the same dogma and we believe that the same group of people are guilty, we can be on some level innocent between ourselves or something like that. And this is why the men in their movement are so fucked up, and sort of end up becoming rapists themselves, because they're so indoctrinated with this sort of identity shame about masculinity, and then they're sort of inverted in some sense, because they have to sort of put up with this guilt, shame, this collective guilt for being a man, but then they have to sort of try to get into this inner sanctum of innocence within their own sort of, stark dichotomy, relationship. When I say relationship, I misspoke. I meant stark dichotomy paradigm. With
Yeah.
and having to see people through the guise of identity. That this is what made the Nazis so pathetic, so stupid. Their culture would not have survived for much longer, because the psychological impact of it, essentially, it degrades language itself. And you can see this in the liberal community. You can see this in the so-called liberal community, how much it gets into sort of, this is why they eventually get into cannibalism and stuff like that, and why eventually they are called useful idiots for a reason, is because if they don't coalesce into a fascistic single identity that is usually centered around ethnicity, and then you end up with an ethno-state which is a separate but equal to other ethno-states, and no one is allowed to mix. That is the only way that you can preserve even a little bit of sanity in some sense, because if you are confronted with this opposed identity, or this different identity, in some sense, because you have competing claims against the status quo, it's just, how does that get worked out? That's why they'll always say, if you listen to these people, these academic people on the radio, they will say things like, oh, it's, yes, these issues are so complicated, they're very complex, and it's very sophisticated, and basically, they never talk about the actual solution to their own fucking ideological problem, which is basically insoluble. It is insoluble, because only one identity will ever be able to sort of take hold of the corpse and have its full meal. Anyway, now I'm sort of ranting too much for the recording, you see. It completely degrades the flow. It might have been better if I had started recording, because then it would have had everything nicely, but then maybe I would have acted strange from the start, and we wouldn't have said all the good things that came before. But you see, now I'm just pontificating. It's not good.
Stop it. Yeah.
Anyway, man, did you?
I can totally see the masculine dude just like, when you're talking about how the men go their own way, like groups like that, it's like probably 20 years from now, they're just going to be like brewing within themselves. It's like, well, I'll show you masculine. It's like, they just like built up this rage to just unleash.
Oh no, I think that men going their own ways are somewhat at least. I don't see that as there might be some elements in it or some individuals in it which are toxic, but I think the general men going their own ways are somewhat a responsible response to culture becoming fascistic. It's a way to avoid having to sort of just wade into that, essentially that cesspool of fascistic values.
Yeah, maybe I'm using them as a wrong example, but just basically the idea of like you're like the man as well, who's just, if for whatever reason they seem like they were treated unjustly or casted out by the female companions, then they themselves has to resolve that within themselves, as like to not let it what's the word, be resentful because of that. So like they also got to like tame that beast. I'm sure like that's a responsibility that they would have to have within themselves. Because like imagine, there's like a class, I don't know if this is correct, but there's a particular word that you give to these people, to guys who essentially can't procreate because they are deemed as
beta.
But is it beta? Like yeah, I'm thinking of a different word. You essentially can't get laid, and it's not like as a derogatory, or at least.
Involuntary celibacy, incel. It's called incel.
Yeah, incels, exactly. And so those particular people, I wonder, it's like, if you're an incel for like till the age of like 50, like would you not be brewing some sort of resentment by that?
Yeah, no, but that, I see what you mean, but I would not conflate incels with men going their own way. I don't think that those are the same.
Right.
but oh yeah,
That's what I said. I'm probably using them as a bad example.
okay, no, but yeah, no, yeah, no, I've seen that. Yeah, when I say I've seen that, I mean I've thought that myself. That incels themselves. See, this is the problem with fascistic ideology, is that even if people don't join it directly, they often replicate it in an opposing way, in some sense. You know, so it's like, in some sense, if fascism were to rise, it would be a sort of an incel thing, right? But it's been completely instigated by the so-called progressives, or the liberals, or the identity politics people. You know, so it's funny, but the identity politics people are trying to promote the incels being Nazis, or trying to grow them into Nazis to justify their own sort of, response to them, or reaction to them rather.
Yeah, see, I see that as like a perfect storm, but like that's just me trying to
Well, you see,
predict
I
the
don't
way the
think the
future might.
incels are actually. I mean, there are some of them, but I mean, most of them are 14-year-old kids who are going. I mean, you must realize that, like, people's psychology, they will often go into toxic ways of. They will explore toxic schemas in order to eventually come out of it, so that they can kind of know it from the inside, and then they can sort of know why it's bad, and then use that experience as to identify other toxic behavior and other toxic themes that are attached to organizations and groups, and then avoid those things. So, there is a stage in life, usually young teenage boys, or not too young, but, like, sort of in the middle of puberty, the emo phase, that's been around, so before there were incels, there were emos, kind of thing. And then there were, different forms of, like, teenage subculture in some sense. And that is part of masculinity. I think that's part of maturing in men in some sense, is that you have to go through a dip in some sense, in order to sort of, you have to sort of bury yourself, and then exhume yourself in some sense. And so I do think that the incels are in more of a dangerous phase than in other times in history, because when we had a more healthy culture in the 90s, for instance, when culture was healthier, yes, there were some kids that were unpopular, and that they never got laid, and maybe they got violent, and maybe they committed suicide. I mean, men do commit suicide much more than other people, but that's usually, I think, a combination of alienation and isolation, which men are often much more the victim of than women are. Um,
Jordan would also say meaning, having an unmeaningful life, or something like that.
yeah, I mean, this has been something that men. I mean, because you see, like, men, in some sense, in our cultural value system, men are expected essentially to do more than women in order to attract women. They have to be better, right? And so, if you can't envisage yourself as being a kind of creditor in that sense, in terms of actually being good for not just yourself, but in order to be responsible for other people, and you can't even yet be responsible for yourself emotionally, and you don't have the hope that you will be in such a state in the future, you can become a kind of hopeless dropout in some sense. Or you can, as a young man that thinks, okay, well, I'm always going to be short, I'm always going to come out low in the stack, I'm not going to be able to have the, I mean, in some sense you could say that, I've often thought it would be so easy to dismantle these feminists and these identity politics people in like a debate on their supposed issues, because it's like, you can easily make the argument that the reason why men have to exploit other men is so that they can afford to be chivalrous to women. Like, that is effectively what the deal is that women have these distorted entitlements, that their female privilege, like, it is linked perhaps also to their biological value and their physical beauty and things like that. So it also has a double-sided effect on women themselves. But because they're not capable of sort of they still want it both ways, and in fact they don't want to suck up to some rich guy to provide it for them. They want the state to give it to them directly, or something like that. They want everyone to have free drinks. All women should have free drinks, not just some. That's basically the point. but in some sense, the free drinks that they get are paid for by men, and this is why men go through what they go through in some sense, and men have just taken it. They have just, this is the way it is. Men have adapted to it because they don't actually hold cultural power. They might hold financial power, but in some sense, that they are driven toward that, because if they don't have status, in some sense, they have no way of sort of dealing with women's sense of entitlement. They have nothing to trade to women in some sense, and so I'm keep on describing vaguely hypergamy in some sense, but and and it is fundamentally problematic because women are incentivized towards hypergamy at a young age. They're even more incentivized, and they're de-incentivized after they don't have any hypergamous sort of currency left in their biological bank account. So it's sort of it's strange. There's no average between those two states in some sense, and the kind of the ideological. Okay, sorry, this is too abstract. But sorry, let me just find my point again, because there was another point that I was in the process of making. Oh, I was just going to say that you can easily make the case that women are by far the instigators. I mean, you can just look at it biologically, historically. Men are left out of the gene pool 40% of the time. Twice as many men as women have essentially been genocided just for being men in some sense. Like, most of our ancestors were women. Like, if you are a woman, you have, like, historically speaking and like biologically speaking, you have an 80% chance to procreate, whereas men only have a 40% chance to procreate.
Yeah.
So it's like, when you look at that differential, you understand why men have to provide more, because if they don't provide more, they just get cut. Goodbye. Whereas women aren't treated like that, essentially. So if you want to talk about structural imbalances, that you could say is what drives men to be in an excess performer in something like that. And then when men see themselves as not being able to compete in that racket in some sense, and not having the hope of being able to compete in that racket, or not being able to sort of find a footing in confronting that challenge, well, this is why explains why men commit suicide so much more than women do, because women have a built-in biological integrity, whereas men have the opposite. They have to actually prove that they're worth the food that they eat, that they consume in some sense. They have to prove, they have to prove their self-esteem, whereas like women just believe that they should be accorded it in some sense. And so, then you get some women who are very intelligent, who are, the cream of the crop in some sense. They are capable of being specialists and experts, and they provide a lot of value, and they actually want status for that value. And, and men even give it to them because, if you provide it, you get the status. Like, that's how the male hierarchy works in some sense. It is competence driven. It's based on your competence and your ability to actually provide value in some sense. I mean, yes, there are toxic elements in it where it's not based on value. It's based on exploitation, or it's based on, it's disguised. It's basically a con game. It's a con job or something like that. And that is why some societies generally do worse than others in some sense. Some cultures are better than others at suppressing. Or this is why the West has been good, is that it's not allowed people with those types of temperaments to be leaders for too long. We take out the Hitlers, basically. We take out the totalitarian, mind-forged, maniacal people, And now we're having slight problems doing it in this case because it's our woman, which we have essentially always put up with. a woman that we've always had to tolerate and make allowances for, in some sense. That, in some sense, I mean, people don't understand this biologically, but we are not like other humanoid species. There are some humanoid species, there's some animal species where men and women are effectively the same. They're very similar, where they have the same strength, they have the same size, they have the same intelligence, and that's just not true for men. Like, men and women have a dimorphism, and you can have exceptional women, but on average, I mean, the men have had to pay a cost for it. I mean, our testosterone kills us effectively, and Jordan Peterson has even said this. And basically, we have to roll the dice. So basically, we have to be brilliant, or we might as well not have been born. So either we're born idiots, or we're born, above average. There are also a lot of average people in some sense. But yeah, but like men are much more throughout the spectrum in some sense. We bear the mark of our dimorphism. Women stack around the center. Women are a stable commodity in that sense, because that's actually how our species destroyed other humanoid species, was because we outbred them, because we didn't risk our woman. The men essentially would go out and do battle against the other humanoid species, and if we died, as long as we didn't risk any of our women, so we would have a consistent expansion, and the humanoid species that had men and women fighting shoulder to shoulder against us, we outbred them, because so I mean, like, and so we were more successful than them, but we have a dimorphic expression, and so that you can't get around that. I mean, obviously, look, I'm not saying that women are weaker than men. There will be individual women who will be geniuses, like that's obvious.
It's a spectrum.
Yeah, I mean, it's a different statistic. I mean, there's a difference between generalization and treating people ethically as individuals, and in some sense, if you, I mean, what I'm saying really only applies to the top in every field, but I mean, like, obviously it's the top of every field that are the super productive, that earn the most money. When you're just talking about an average man and an average woman, well, if you actually look at the medium man and the medium woman is more intelligent than the medium man. Sort of, if you were to rank everyone's IQ and just add them up like quantitative numbers, women would be more intelligent. Women have more IQ points than men collectively, but that is fucking meaningless. That's not how. Like, that's just to overlook reality. The functioning of reality is that we don't have enough talented people. We don't have enough geniuses working things. That's why things are so fucked up. But anyway, this is a huge tangent. I mean, this is why law firms struggle so hard to retain their female lawyers, because they are geniuses. I mean, they really are. I mean, you meet female lawyers, they are really very, very bright people, and they chose that profession because they knew that they could trade in their brilliance for money, and then eventually they marry someone who makes more money than them, and then they rather want a family, and then they want to leave their firm or cut down their hours, and it's like, that's like, people need intelligent people working on matters that are sophisticated. We just don't have enough brains in our population. Like, we just don't. Like,
You can see it in movies and artistic designs.
Well, yeah, in terms of the quality of writing, is that what you mean?
Well, yeah, exactly, like scripts and yeah.
And and we actually live in a society in which even the below average benefit tremendously from other people being able to be utilized and their talents utilized. But as soon as you introduce identity politics into an economy, you basically sabotage it. I mean, that's what's happened in South Africa. So we've got lots and lots of identity consciousness, and we've got no economic growth, which is ridiculous because we're a third world country that you would expect to be growing robustly, and we should be growing robustly, but the government has literally done everything it can to basically strangle the economy and to make it dysfunctional so that they could use quotas and affirmative action effectively to completely slash and burn the economy, and then blame business afterwards for not being transformative enough, for not going with business or something, for not going with government. Whereas how can a small company of 3 people be 80% black? That means you can't have anyone that is not black in that company. I mean, it's impossible to meet their quotas, and it's hard enough just to get people with the right skills that you need. Now you have to start counting people's racial profile. I mean, and then they get headhunted. It's impossible to train someone or give people skills, and then they just get headhunted by big companies. I mean, it has nothing to do with the value of productivity. It has nothing to do with the value of labor. It's a completely dysfunctional market. They've completely poisoned the labor market in my country. It's ridiculous. And then they just complain more about structural things and historical things. And it's like, well, what about these structural social injustices that you are doing to people based on people's race, just so that you can sort of make your paradigm true, which then becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy as to why we need to be more violent and radical and give the government even more influence over resources. Yeah.
Like, they already know that it's like, it's playing out right now in my everyday life. What are you talking about? I'm creating this prophecy. See what I'm saying? They're already deluded to it.
Yeah, it is problematic in terms of how to confront it. As I said, like, I think the only way is to talk about how they are treating the identity, and how that is making parts of reality invisible, and how it is even making parts of the problem invisible and parts of the fake solution invisible. That what is essentially, I call it ideological corruption. I believe the phrase ideological corruption has to start becoming a thing. That we have to start seeing that corruption itself of society, of the corruption of power in some sense, is linked inextricably to this ideology. Damn, I really wish I had the earlier stuff that we talked about recorded, because that would have gone so well on my YouTube to like just describe the deconstruction of that earlier stuff. But anyway, I'm not gonna go back to it. But I wonder, Eskii, maybe I can invite you to one of. What?
I think we got a delay. But I was gonna. Oh shit! What was it I gonna say? Oh yeah, we first started out talking about, which is really funny. We started talking about like the forums and how like people having authorities can abuse that power, and then I kind of like, I think I changed it into, well, isn't that what you're seeing in Google if you push it to the extremes? And I think there was more nuance to that. Yeah, and then we just divulged into this rabbit hole.
But yeah, I would really watch the Sargon of Akkad video, because he covers this like really well. Have you seen that one?
I've seen a bunch of his videos. At this point, I don't even remember like what the titles are.
I mean, this video came out very recently. It came out like 3 days ago or something.
Oh, okay, yeah, I haven't been paying attention.
It's really worth watching. It's called Google is Unfair, and he talks about conceptual fairness versus procedural fairness. And it's funny because it actually covers a lot of the same substance in my last YouTube video. It deals with Google, and I wasn't talking about Google at all, but the same kind of philosophical substance is dealt with. I can find a link for you if you want.
Let me see. The last thing I watched was Why Do People Hate Feminists? I said, oh, right, Google Unfair. Yeah, 4 days ago. Right.
Anyway, I'm going to stop my recording. I don't think I'm going to use this because I don't like complaining